Hello everyone, I'm Rajesh Gupta and we are talking about the developments in the contemporary art after India's independence. So we have looked into the painting practices, that how different kind of painting practices like oil on canvas and of course that the works on paper and so on, they have progressed in the after the India's independence. Now here we see the use of sculpture and printmaking. So we'll start our discussion with sculpture, and of course that sculpture also has a long history, and for our time constraint I won't be looking into too many of those examples, but few things for us to understand that what are the relevance of sculpture we find. Now, unlike painting, like the painting on canvas, which requires an indoor space, and many times that we see that how they are utilized by the government bodies or the institutions are restricted. So, in that term, we find that sculptures from very early times, from during the colonial time period and after India's independence, there were need for making public sculptures. So it was very different from the way we see the paintings in the gallery spaces or in the indoor spaces, and then many of the sculptures that we find them to be placed in the important public places. So that also had this impact on how the training in sculpture had began and how it continued in the post independence India. So in one hand, if we see that there were the sculptures which were required by the government officials, by the city councils and other bodies, the government bodies, so for this public places. But then we also find that there were sculptural practices which were much more inclined towards the individualistic practices, which would be closer to what the people in Bombay Progressive Artist Group or people like Ghulam Sheikh and all were doing. So coming back to what was happening in the public sculptures, so this is one of the examples, very well known example, which is called the Tramp of Labor, and it was made by D.P. Roy Choudhury, and D.P. Roy Choudhury was trained in the Government School of Art in Calcutta, and he knew the art scene in early 20th century Bengal. So and then he moved to Madras for teaching and in the Government School of Art in Madras, and eventually he became the principal in the school. So what we find in this particular image, which is called the Tramp of Labor, and it is prominently featured near this very well known site, which is known as Marina Beach in Chennai. So what we see here, that there is this high pedestal onto which there are those laboring bodies that we find, the laboring human bodies, all of them are men. So what they try to do here is that we see that they are trying to throw a hurdle out of their way, and the hurdle is this large piece of stone. And so this is something that we find that this large piece of stone cannot be removed by one person, but it is something that, if people come together as a group, if some people come together as a collective, then this collective effort can make this impossible into possible. So this is a message that we find that is conveyed in this sculpture, and this is a bronze casting. So again, going back to some of the classical sculptural medium which we find in the European context. So many European sculptors that we find from Rodin and Giacometti and so on, we find that all of them have worked with this medium. And so in here what we find that, and bronze is also something that gives permanence to the forms. So since this form is open in an open space, and then there is no canopy or anything on the top of it, so it needed to be made in a with the material which is stable enough to bear the climatic conditions and everything else. So this, what we find in this sculpture is that there is this meticulous depiction of these laboring bodies, that all of these bodies that we see, they only wear loin cloth, and perhaps in some places we see that they also have this cloth that is wrapped around their head like a turban. So this is something that is a sign of the the laborers who work in our country. They can be agricultural laborers, they can be the laborers in various construction sites, they can be artisanal labor. So what we find there is that these laborers are not people who are always recognized for their work. And in this monumental sculpture, the laborers are the ones who are given the priority, or whose work has been celebrated. So that is the reason we see that their bodies are not really heroic. All the muscles and the veins, everything are seen in their body. But all of them, all of them, when they put together their work, then the impossible hurdle can be removed from the way. Now if we also think about its situation, that this sculpture is actually situated on high pedestal. So high pedestal like this, and if there is a person who will be standing here, so our height, our height will probably be around the pedestal, so we'll have to look up at this sculpture. So this is not something that we see the sculpture being on the eye level as we walk. So this is and what does that do? We definitely have a long history of using pedestals in the European context, and of course with the colonial art education, this idea of pedestal had also emerged in the Indian subcontinent. Now what the pedestal did was, usually we find that there were those figures who are the important figures for administration, for the state and for the nation. So those figures were the ones who were featured on this high pedestal. But now when we see that there are those this common the people who are not acknowledged anywhere else for their work, they are featured prominently on this high pedestal where everyone else can see them. So that makes a different kind of, that gives a different message from the ones which were already there. So the figures, the so-called the great figures on who were featured on the pedestal, if we compare that to the one that we see here, the tramp of labor, so there we certainly see a shift that had taken place after India's independence. And this was also something we can imagine. It was not, and it was not the idea of D.P. Roy Choudhury, but it was a common emotion that many people had shared during this time. So the first president, the first prime minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, we find that he had prioritized the work of the farmers, the agricultural laborers, and of course the soldiers. And then he had also proclaimed that how the collective work and then the technological progress, all these things are very much important than for building the new country. So this kind of representation, or this idea of acknowledging the people who work for all of us, is something that comes with the birth of this new nation. So this figure, this sculpture was installed in 1959 in Chennai or in Madras. So if we think about the kind of material which were used, and then of course that bronze or stone, which are considered as the more classical media, and then there are also different kind of objects or different kind of materials which can be turned into sculptural form. Now we see that this classical forms, this heavy metals or stones and other things which have this weight, and one needs to put tremendous amount of labor to work through, to work with them. So those are the ones which were prioritized in the sculptural work. Also we find that there were the gender politics. So in terms of this more established sculptural media, those were definitely been considered as the masculine media. Now we find that there were some of the artists in in 1970s and 1980s who had challenged that notion, and they have also successfully expanded the notion of sculpture beyond this more conventional mediatic expressions. So one of them would be Mrinalini Mukherjee. So Mrinalini Mukherjee is the daughter of Vinod Bihari Mukherjee, that one of the murals by Mukherjee that we have seen in Shantiniketan in the earlier lecture. So Mrinalini Mukherjee was trained as a painter, and she did not have institutional training in doing sculpture, but then she became more and more interested in different kind of natural fibers like hemp and nettle and so on, and she started knotting them and making them into forms. So this painstaking process, which would start by doing the small knots and putting them together into an organic form, so that is something we find that those were then later on displayed as the sculptural works. So the image that we have in the left side of the screen, here we see that one of her work is hung from the tree, and that is because that and of course this is the artist Mrinalini Mukherjee. She is here with her work. So what we find here is this entire work that is made by knotting. So this entire work is something that is made by her with the use of these fibers, the hemp fiber and nettle fiber, and then this kind of forms cannot stand on its own. So they need to be hung, or they need to be supported by something. But once they are hung, they have these gigantic forms, and the forms which can be in some way comparable to the sculptures. So, but of course that for their material quality, they also have they have the organic growth within them, which is not possible in the more conventional sculptural materials. So these are some of the ways in which we find that she had challenged this idea of what can be a sculpture, what cannot be a sculpture. So those things, and through that she had paved the way for many other artists who'd come to work with fiber, and how to expand this idea of sculptural expression, at the same time how to also dismantle the boundary between the way we understand the the masculine material and the feminine ones. So these are some of the ways in which we find that it's not always on the surface, but there are silent gestures, silent protest against these hierarchies which were already established in the field of fine art. And also it's not just there in the field of fine art, but in the society, in terms of the gender hierarchy and our identification in terms of what we choose to do. So this kind of work, we find that they had sent this strong message towards understanding the world, or having a different worldview to reassess these situations. Now from sculpture, if you look into the other practices, we find that there are printmaking practices, and in the printmaking practices, as we have already discussed, that how relief, intaglio and planographic prints, those were introduced during the colonial time. So those colonial practices, when we talk about the printmaking practices in the post-independence India, we still talk about this colonial practices. The printmakers did not go back to the indigenous printmaking practices, but they explored newer possibilities of the techniques which were taught by the colonial institutions. So here there are some of the prints, and as we can see that there are those the prints are by Somnath Hor. So Somnath Hor was a printmaker, and he operated from 1940s. So in the early 1940s we find that there is this famine in Kolkata, and then also we find that there were the attempts of the Communist Party of India to see the different working conditions of laborers and agricultural workers in various parts of India. So Somnath Hor had traveled various places in Bengal to see that, I mean, what were their livelihood and quality of living. So from there we find that he had traveled across Bengal, and his travelogue was full of drawings, and then he had also made this superb woodcuts from those drawings and those ink drawings. I mean, both, like, I mean, pencil drawing and ink drawing. So those are the ones which we find that, I mean, those were then translated into woodcut. Now, why did he make them into woodcut, like the one that we see it here, for example, in the right side of the screen? So why did he make them into woodcut is because that as he had traveled with the Communist Party of India, there was a need for making booklets, and those booklets to be circulated with among many people, so that the urban people who did not really knew about the dire condition of this famine in the rural Bengal and also in the other urban places, so they can be aware of this. They can also come forward and they can help in to change this situation. So these were some of the reasons why we find that he had chosen the expression of woodcut, and woodcut also has this the graphic quality, that's something that we have discussed. If we consider the image of Gandhiji, that is by Nandalal Bose, and many other images that we have seen. So there we find that this graphic division of light and dark in areas in woodcut, for example, that we see here, the stark dark figures, and then like the areas which are illuminated. So this help gaining immediate attention from the viewers, and also this starkness in the images also talk about this stark condition, and which the hunger, the distress and everything. So that is how we find that how for its use for circulation, but also to show the starkness of this situation, how Somnath Hor had employed woodcut for communicating his thoughts and his experiences to a wider audience. And similar thing we can say about the image of the famine in Calcutta, which was there in the early 1940s. So this image is made in mid 1950s, the image in the left side of the screen. And what we see here is this: there are those two slightly stylized images, and both of them are children, and these two are they clearly suffer from malnutrition, and for the reason this disproportionate bodies are shown there, and two of them, they closely hold each other, and perhaps there in front of this undefined future. So this is something we find, and this idea of the starkness, that they are placed against this dark background, all those things are shown here. And perhaps the stylization here we see it also something that exemplifies the bone structures of the body and the faces, like the way if we see the faces here, like how the cheekbones and then the depth and the dark recesses under the eyes, around the eyes, those are shown here. So this is something that we find that this stylization is not there for exploring the form, but it is there to sort of exemplify or to emphasize this situation of their dire condition. So this is something we find, that this stylization, as opposed to this this representation where we find that this is much more a naturalistic representation of the scene. So this stylization is something that was intentional, and why this is also something that we need to understand as contextual. So the stylization is not there for the artist to explore the form, but it is there for as I have already mentioned, to emphasize this bony structure of the bodies, to show this malnutrition, this condition of these people. So this is something we find that Somnath Hoare had explored to a great extent in his works. So from there we find that Somnath Hoare had slowly ventured into this idea of a wound. So we find that Somnath Hoare in between had also operated in Delhi, and then had also seen many other events which added to his experience of recording the distress among common people, and that eventually led him to do his this celebrated wound series. And in the 1960s, 1970s, we find that he had experimented with this print, for example the one we see in the left side of the screen, in which all the details of the narratives, all the details of the human bodies and everything else have been removed, and what remains here is marks, the marks which resemble wounds on our bodies. And if we see the kind of the wound that he created onto the etching plate, so etching plate is basically, this is the intaglio plate onto which all these marks are created, and then the print of it is taken on a paper. So what we see, the kind of mark is there, that there are again those starkness we find, that there are the depth of the marks which are certainly not pleasant, and then there is how those marks are exemplified or emphasized by this slight hint of color and then the stark background. So these are some of the characteristic features we find that Somnath Hoare's work had. And with time we also find that he had the way he had worked on the etching plate. So if you remember that, I mean, we have spoken about the use of etching plate for doing the very fine lines. So the linear drawings are well executed on etching plate, whereas in Somnath Hoare's work we do not really see any of those fine lines, but we see there are those large surfaces which were perhaps kept open. There was no acid resistant material in it, and he dipped them into the acid bath, and that is how large areas of the etching plate was etched, and that is how those wound marks were created onto the etching plate. So in other words, we see that from his highly narrative works, he moved towards gestural works, where the process itself would be a reminder of this idea that if we talk about the wound in our body, then the material, or like the process of making the wound itself, also reflects making of a wound on the etching plate. So that is how this idea and the material explorations, they came together in Somnath Hoare's work. Now the other things that we also find that which also had high prominence in his work is that he had moved to few of the other much more unconventional works, and that is like a pulp print. So this is a pulp print that we find, and that was done in 1970s, and he continued making this pulp print. So what is a pulp print? So we find in this time like either cement block or block of plaster of Paris he had chosen to work with, and then on those blocks of plaster of Paris, if someone drops a water, if someone drops water on it, or like, I mean, if there is an object that is just put on this on this block of plaster of Paris or cement, when it is still not when it is still wet, then this the movement of the water drops, or like, I mean, the shape of the objects which are dropped on it, that also makes a recessed area in it, or like different kind of forms are created on them, and all these forms also reflected his idea of the wound. So then what we find, that he allowed those blocks to be dried, so that, I mean, these gestural marks which are created on this wet surface, on the soft surface, is made permanent. And then on the top of that he had placed pulp paper, and that is how the impression of these wounds are taken onto this pulp paper. So that is how we find how this paper making has also been part of his expression of creating wounds. So if we consider that, I mean, what was happening in Somnath Hore's work, we find that from this narrative expressions, he had moved to this minimal use of line and this economic expression, but at the same time he held the essence of all those, the distress and this periodic experiences of evidencing things which disturbed him. So those things, if those things were expressed in the narrative form in his early woodcut, and then later on in his in this pulp print as well as in his etching print, we find that he had explored different possibilities, different avenues to see that how printmaking can still be utilized for expressing his concern, expressing his thoughts. We'll continue on this in the next lecture. Thank you.